My name is Naomi Ellison. I was 27 when I realized that silence could hurt more than harsh words. The florist was adjusting the white lilies for the third time when my phone vibrated again. I didn't need to read the messages to know what they said. My mother had already made herself painfully clear the night before. "We're not coming, Naomi." The wedding chapel felt strangely peaceful despite the storm growing inside me. Morning sunlight spilled through stained glass windows, painting soft patches of blue and gold across the empty pews. Those colors reminded me of Sunday mornings from childhood, when my father used to lift me onto his shoulders after church. Back then, I believed families always found their way back to each other. I was wrong. My fiancé, Daniel, stood outside greeting the few guests who had arrived early. He wore the same gentle smile that had first caught my attention 2 years earlier, not because he was wealthy or impressive, but because he noticed people others ignored. He worked as a janitor at the downtown hospital, and somehow he carried more dignity than executives wearing tailored suits. My family never saw that. To them, his uniform erased everything else. My older sister had laughed when I announced our engagement. "A janitor? After everything you've achieved?" Even now, those words echoed louder than I wanted to admit. I glanced toward the entrance every few minutes, pretending I wasn't hoping anyone, might change their mind. My grandmother, my younger cousin, my father. The doors remained closed. Only 12 guests sat scattered across nearly 100 seats. Every empty row looked like another sentence my family had chosen not to say aloud. Daniel walked over quietly. "You don't have to smile for anyone," he whispered. His hand found mine, warm and steady. I know, but the truth was more complicated. I wasn't grieving because they disapproved of my marriage. I was grieving because somewhere inside me, a little girl was still waiting for her family to choose her. The ceremony began exactly on time. As I reached the aisle, I noticed one final empty seat in the front row. It had been reserved for my parents. No one ever sat there. I told myself I could live with that. I had no idea that before sunset, a 10-second video would reach every phone in my family, and nothing they believed about Daniel, or about me, would ever be the same. The ceremony passed with a kind of quiet beauty I hadn't expected. There was no dramatic interruption. No last-minute arrival. No speech from a family member who had suddenly come to their senses. Just the gentle voice of the officiant, the scent of fresh lilies, and Daniel looking at me as though I were the only person in the room. When we exchanged vows, my voice trembled only once. Not because I doubted him, because I finally accepted who wasn't there. Afterward, our guests gathered in the garden behind the chapel. Someone laughed as children chased soap bubbles across the grass. A violinist played softly beneath an old maple tree. It was smaller than the wedding I had imagined growing up, but somehow it felt more honest. Daniel handed me a glass of sparkling cider. "You keep looking toward the gate," he said gently. "I know. Are you hoping they'll come?" I stared at the gravel path. I'm hoping they'll regret not coming." The word surprised even me. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he brushed a loose strand of hair behind my ear, the way he always did when he sensed I was fighting tears instead of letting them exist. "You deserved better," he said. Simple words. No criticism of my family. No anger. Just truth. That was Daniel. People saw the gray maintenance uniform. They saw the mop cart, the work gloves, the long hours spent polishing hospital floors. They never saw how every Friday he brought coffee to the exhausted night nurses without being asked. They never noticed him repairing a patient's broken wheelchair during his lunch break or sitting quietly with frightened children while their parents met with doctors. He never spoke about those moments. To him, kindness wasn't something to announce. It was simply part of the day. My family had decided who he was within minutes of hearing his job title. None of them had cared enough to learn the rest. I remembered the dinner where everything had fallen apart. My mother folded her napkin with careful precision before saying, "You've always been capable of more than this." "I love him," I'd answered. "You'll outgrow that." My father remained silent, studying his plate as though it contained an answer he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. My sister had smiled politely. "People marry their equals, Naomi. that sentence had stayed with me for months. Not because it was cruel, because for a while I wondered if they believed I had somehow become less. A breeze carried the sound of laughter back toward us. Daniel squeezed my hand. Our photographer wants a few sunset pictures. I nodded, forcing myself back into the present. As we walked toward the gardens, I noticed Daniel's phone vibrate several times in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen. His expression didn't change. He simply locked the phone again. "Everything okay?" I asked. He smiled. "Just someone from work." I believed him. At least, I thought I did. What I couldn't have known was that, miles away, someone inside the hospital had already uploaded a 10-second security clip. It wasn't meant to go viral. It wasn't even meant for my family. But within the next few hours, that tiny video would land in the one group chat where my name had become a subject no one wanted to discuss, and for the first time, they would see the man behind the uniform. By the time the sun slipped below the trees, the reception had settled into an easy rhythm. Guests lingered over dessert, conversations drifted from one table to another, and someone convinced Daniel to join a slow dance, even though he insisted he had 2 left feet. He laughed the entire time. Watching him, I realized something that hurt and healed me at once. The people who truly loved us didn't need a crowded ballroom to celebrate. They had shown up. They had chosen us. My phone stayed face down beside my plate. I had stopped expecting it to ring. Then it buzzed. Once. Twice. Again. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen all day. Dad. Before I could answer, another notification appeared. Then another. My mother. My sister. 2 cousins. An aunt. The family group chat, silent for weeks, suddenly filled with messages, so quickly I could barely read them. "Naomi, please call us." We didn't know. Is this really Daniel? I frowned. Daniel noticed the change in my expression. What happened? I don't know. My hands felt strangely cold as I opened the first message. There was no explanation. Only a video. 10 seconds long. I pressed play. The footage came from a hospital security camera. The picture wasn't perfect, and there was no sound, only silent movement beneath bright hallway lights. An elderly man collapsed near the reception desk. People froze for a heartbeat. Daniel didn't. He dropped everything in his hands and reached the man within seconds, steadying him until the emergency team arrived. Even after the doctors took over, he stayed beside the man's frightened wife, helping her sit down, offering her water, speaking with a calm that somehow reached through a silent recording. The clip ended there. Just 10 seconds. No dramatic music. No heroic pose. Just instinctive kindness. I looked at Daniel. "When was this?" He blinked, surprised. "Oh, a few months ago." "You never told me." He shrugged, almost embarrassed. There wasn't much to tell. The medical team did the important work. That answer sounded exactly like him. Then another message appeared. This one for my father. "The man who collapsed, that's Mr. Aldridge. He's been my client for nearly 20 years. He told everyone the hospital janitor was the first person who helped him." I never knew he meant Daniel. A lump formed in my throat. Another message followed from my mother. "We judged him before we knew him." I stared at those words for a long moment. They were the closest thing to an apology I'd received. Yet something inside me refused to rush toward forgiveness. Not because I wanted revenge, but because one question kept echoing in my mind. If that video had never existed, would they have ever believed my judgment was enough? I didn't answer the messages that night. Not because I wanted my family to worry, but because I needed one evening where my happiness wasn't interrupted by the same people who had questioned it. I slipped my phone into my purse and returned to the reception. Daniel was thanking the caterers. He knew every server's name by the end of the evening. He thanked the woman collecting empty plates with the same warmth he thanked our photographer. Watching him move through the room, I understood why strangers trusted him so easily. Respect wasn't something he performed. It was simply how he lived. Later, after our guests had gone and the hall had grown quiet, we sat on the steps outside the chapel. My wedding shoes rested beside me, and the cool stone beneath my feet felt strangely comforting. The messages keep coming. I admitted. Daniel looked toward the stars instead of my phone. You don't have to read them tonight. I already did. He waited. He never rushed me into filling silence. They're apologizing. He nodded once. How do you feel? I searched for the right word. Confused. That was the truth. Part of me had wished for this moment for months. I had imagined my family realizing they were wrong. I had imagined relief washing over me. Instead, I felt tired. The apology I had dreamed about couldn't give me back the evenings I cried alone after family dinners. It couldn't erase the dress shopping trip where my mother refused to come. It couldn't fill the empty front row at our wedding. Some moments become part of your life forever, even after they're over. The next morning, my father called again. This time, I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. You do. I judged Daniel by his job. Yes. And I didn't trust the daughter I raised. His voice cracked on the last sentence. That hurt more than anything else. Because beneath all the pride and silence, I could hear regret. Real regret. I kept thinking I was protecting you, he said softly. I never asked to be protected from kindness. Silence settled between us again. Then, he whispered something I had waited years to hear. I was wrong. Tears gathered in my eyes, but they didn't fall. Not yet. Being told someone was wrong didn't instantly heal the wound they had caused. Healing asked for something slower. Consistency. Humility.
Time.
Before we ended the call, my father asked one quiet question. Would you and Daniel have dinner with us? I looked through the hotel window where Daniel was helping pack leftover flowers into boxes so guests could take them home. The same man they had once dismissed without meeting. I took a slow breath. I'll think about it. It wasn't punishment. It was honesty. Because forgiveness, I was beginning to learn, isn't a door that opens with a single apology. Sometimes it's a path people have to walk, one small step at a time. A week passed before I called my father back. Not because I wanted to make anyone wait, because I needed enough distance to hear my own heart instead of my old habit of pleasing everyone else. We'll come, I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet, relieved, thank you. The dinner was set for Sunday evening. As Daniel and I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed everything looked exactly as it always had. The flower beds my mother carefully tended. The porch swing my father built when I was 12. The wind chimes that somehow survived every storm. It was strange how familiar places could suddenly feel unfamiliar. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand. We can leave whenever you want. I smiled. That's why I wanted you beside me. When the front door opened, my mother stood there holding it with both hands. For the first time in years, she didn't begin with advice or questions. She simply looked at me, then at Daniel. I'm glad you came. It wasn't dramatic, but it was different. Inside, my sister Emily was already setting the table. Weeks earlier, she had called Daniel a mistake. Now she struggled to meet his eyes. I made your favorite lemon pie, she said quietly. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because she remembered my favorite dessert after forgetting something far more important, that I deserved to have my choices respected. Dinner began awkwardly. Forks touched plates. Glasses clinked. Conversation wandered towards safe topics like weather and work, carefully avoiding the reason we were all sitting together. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. Your garden looks beautiful, he said to my mother. Her eyes widened slightly. Thank you. I can tell how much care goes into it. No resentment. No sarcasm. Just a genuine compliment. I watched my mother's shoulders soften, almost imperceptibly. Halfway through the meal, my father stood and disappeared into his study. He returned carrying a worn cardboard box. I found these, he said, placing it gently on the table. Inside were dozens of photographs. School plays, birthday parties, family vacations. There was one of me at 8 years old, missing my front teeth, proudly holding a drawing I'd made for career day. Across the top, written in uneven crayons, were the words, "Be kind to everyone." My father held the picture for a long moment. You've been trying to live by this your whole life, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Somewhere along the way, I stopped following the lesson you learned before I did. The room fell completely still. No one argued. No one defended themselves. For the first time, no one searched for excuses. Then my mother turned toward Daniel. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I never asked who you were. Daniel looked at her with the same calm expression I had seen countless times. You asked what I did for work, he replied gently. They're not always the same question. No one spoke after that, because everyone at the table understood that those 12 quiet words revealed more truth than the 10-second video ever could. And for the first time since my wedding day, I felt something shift, not in them alone, but in me. The weight I'd been carrying no longer felt like mine to hold by myself. After that dinner, my family began reaching out more often, not in grand, dramatic ways. My father started calling every Sunday afternoon, usually with simple questions that had nothing to do with the past. He would ask how work was going or whether Daniel had finished reading the novel he'd mentioned over dinner. My mother began sending recipes she thought we might enjoy. Sometimes she added a short note at the bottom. I remembered you liked cinnamon more than vanilla. Tiny things. Things that would have seemed ordinary to anyone else. To me, they felt like people learning a language they should have spoken years ago. Still, trust didn't return as quickly as their messages did. One rainy evening, Daniel found me standing by the living room window, watching water slide down the glass. You've forgiven them, he said softly. I shook my head. I've decided not to live inside the hurt anymore. He smiled. Those aren't exactly the same thing.
No.
I turned toward him. I don't know if they'll ever be. He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Daniel had never expected me to rush my healing. He understood that forgiveness wasn't something you handed over because someone asked for it. It was something that grew quietly, often without announcing itself. A few days later, my mother invited us to a family barbecue. The invitation sat unanswered on the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Old memories whispered that I would always be the daughter who disappointed everyone. New memories reminded me that people could change, if they were willing to keep showing it. Finally, I picked up my phone. We'll come. The afternoon turned out to be surprisingly peaceful. My cousins welcomed Daniel without hesitation. My aunt asked him about his work, but this time she listened instead of assuming. He spoke about keeping hospital spaces clean because patients deserved dignity during some of the hardest days of their lives. No one interrupted him. No one smiled politely before changing the subject. They listened. As we were leaving, my father walked us to the car. He hesitated before speaking. I've spent months wishing I could erase your wedding day. I looked at him quietly. I know, but if I could erase it, I'd probably erase the lesson too. The words settled between us. Pain had changed all of us, not because suffering is noble, but because facing the truth had forced us to become more honest than we had ever been before. As we drove home, Daniel reached for my hand. The road ahead stretched into the fading light, calm and open. For the first time, I wasn't looking back to see who had failed to follow. I was looking ahead, wondering what kind of family we would choose to become. Nearly a year passed before our first wedding anniversary arrived. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt gentle rather than perfect. Daniel still left for the hospital before sunrise, carrying the same worn lunch bag he'd owned since before we met. I still teased him about replacing it, and he still insisted it had a few good years left. Some things never changed. I had learned to appreciate that. One Saturday afternoon, while sorting through a closet, I found our wedding album tucked inside a storage box. Dust clung to the cover, and for a moment I simply held it, remembering how impossible it had once felt to look at those photographs. Daniel sat beside me on the living room floor. Ready? He asked. I think so. We turned the pages slowly. There was the chapel glowing in the afternoon light. The flowers. Our first dance. Friends laughing around candlelit tables. Then we reached the photograph of the front row. The empty seats. I stared at them much longer than I expected. A year ago, those empty chairs had represented rejection. Now, they reminded me of something different. A moment that changed all of us. Not because of the pain itself, but because none of us had allowed that pain to become the final chapter. A few days later, my parents invited us to dinner again. This time, there was no awkwardness waiting behind the front door. My mother hugged Daniel before she hugged me. It was brief, almost shy, but genuine. During dinner, my father disappeared into the hallway and returned carrying a small wooden frame. "I've been meaning to give you this." Inside the frame was a photograph I had never seen before. It had been taken outside the chapel just after the ceremony. Daniel and I were laughing at something neither of us could remember now. Behind us, through the chapel windows, the empty front row was barely visible. At the bottom of the frame, my father had written a single sentence in careful handwriting. "Love deserves to be recognized before it is admired." I traced the words with my fingertips. No apology could have rewritten the past. But this wasn't an attempt to rewrite it. It was an acknowledgement of it. As we prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the porch. "I still think about that day," she admitted. "So do I. I wish I had been sitting in the front row." I smiled gently. "I know." She looked at me with quiet tears in her eyes. "Thank you for giving us another chance to become the family we should have been." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked back through the open doorway. Daniel was laughing with my father in the kitchen, washing dishes together as if they'd been doing it for years. Healing, I realized, rarely announces itself. Sometimes it simply looks like ordinary moments that once seemed impossible. And standing there beneath the soft glow of the porch light, I understood that the most meaningful apologies are not spoken once. They are lived, one ordinary day at a time. On the morning of our second wedding anniversary, I returned to the chapel alone. Not because I was sad. Because I wanted to thank the version of myself who had walked through those doors despite believing she had lost her family. The building was quiet, just as it had been before the ceremony began. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, scattering familiar colors across the wooden pews. I found myself smiling. The empty front row no longer lived in my memory as a wound. It had become a reminder, not of who failed me, but of the life Daniel and I chose anyway. I closed my eyes and remembered the frightened bride who kept glancing toward the entrance, hoping someone would appear. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't promise that everything would become easy. I'd simply tell her this. The people who truly love you don't always arrive on time. Sometimes they have to grow before they can meet you where you are. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "You disappeared," he said with a grin. "I had somewhere I needed to visit." He didn't ask where. He never demanded explanations for feelings that needed quiet instead of questions. We sat together watching the neighborhood wake up. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A mail carrier waved as he passed. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes stirred in the morning breeze. Ordinary sounds. Extraordinary peace. A notification lit up my phone. It was a message from my mother. There was no apology this time. No attempt to revisit the past. Just a photograph. It showed our entire family gathered around the dining table the previous weekend, smiling without effort. In the center of the frame sat Daniel, laughing at something my father had just said. Beneath the picture, she had written, "Thank you for believing our family could become better than its worst moment." I looked at the message for a long time before placing the phone face down. Years earlier, I would have needed those words to prove something. Now they simply felt like a gift. The 10-second video had never changed who Daniel was. It hadn't created his kindness. It hadn't given him dignity. It had only revealed what had always been there. And perhaps that was the lesson I carried forward. People are rarely defined by the titles written on name badges, business cards, or uniforms. They are defined by the quiet choices they make when no one expects applause. As for my family, they couldn't erase the empty seats at my wedding. Neither could I. But those empty seats no longer represented rejection. They represented a promise we all learned too late, yet chose to keep afterward. Never measure a person's worth by the work they do. Measure it by the care they leave behind. That, more than any video or apology, became the inheritance our family passed from one generation to the next. If this story touched your heart, remember this. The deepest wounds are not always healed by dramatic moments, but by small acts of humility, patience, and consistent love. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong, it's giving them the opportunity to become better. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness is never wasted. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if your family had boycotted your wedding? Your story might encourage someone who needs hope today.